just give you the privilege to take it away and minister to us as you feel this evening. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an absolute joy to be with you. Genuinely, I love it. And I love your reflections. And I know people will be mulling things over and thinking things through. And of course, the beauty of doing something like this over 6 weeks is that we get to sort of get multiple bites at one cherry. You're sort of having a go at stuff from different angles, and it allows us to build a little bit of a picture, which allows us to bring different facets of what it means to be together onto the table so that we can think about that. So well done for being part of it. Tonight we're looking at walking together and specifically drilling into the idea of relational. So we've looked at creational from the Genesis design. We've looked at spiritual from Psalms 133 and that idea of living together. And now we're pushing it a wee bit further now, and we're digging a wee bit further into relational. So the progression on this for your thinking is that creational speaks of design, and then the second place I wanted to go was spiritual, because we are fundamentally spiritual beings first. So we live in a material world totally. We have material dynamics and elements to our experience, of course. We have human body, etc., and physicality. But we are, in essence and essentially, made in the image of God. And I think fundamentally that essence is that we are spiritual beings. And so you get this, I think we've got to understand together from a design format, but also from a spirituality format. We're not just coming at this organizationally or coming at this because it's a cool idea. We're coming at this because it's fundamental to our design and to our God-shaped spirituality, which is, brought to us through Christ Jesus. So then the natural next bit is sort of thinking about it relationally. How do we see the benefits of some of this, or even the challenges of it? And I wanted to take us to Ecclesiastes chapter 4, beautiful passage from a difficult book. Ecclesiastes is, some might call it subversive. It's a subversive book. What we mean by it is it challenges some of the fundamental ideas of the scripture. There's almost things in the book of Ecclesiastes that you go, what? Is that really in the Bible? Did he really say that? And yes, he did. And it's some of the stuff in there is quite, I would say, genuinely outrageous. But it's within the context of a journey that we understand the book of Ecclesiastes. A great book, a great 21st century book, if properly understood and grappled with, but not always easy, some of the concepts. But right in the heart of this, the writer says these words. So Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 9, let me read them to you. He says this: two are better than one, because they have good reward for their toil or their work. For if they fall, one will lift up his friend, but woe to him who is alone when he falls and does not have someone to lift him up. Again, if two lie down together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him. And then it concludes with this: a threefold cord is not easily or quickly broken. And that's from the ESV, the English Standard Version. There, you may have different versions there, but they'll more or less say the same thing. It's a fairly consistent interpretation across the translations. And we see within that the power of together. Now, let me just start by saying something you may have come across. Most times I've ever heard Ecclesiastes 4 referenced, it's in the context of marriage. And it's normally it's read out maybe in a marriage ceremony. That has been, I would say, 95% of the time I've ever heard this referenced, it's been in the context of marriage relationship or even a marriage ceremony. And I totally get why. It fits beautifully and it's a wonderful thing to bring. But we must be honest to the text. It has strictly nothing to do directly with marriage. Now, of course, it has application to marriage, but the writer is not speaking about marriage. He's speaking here about human community and the power of that community. whether that is expressed in marriage or expressed in family or expressed in a community or expressed perhaps in other facets. He is talking here about the power of community. And I think that's really important for us to understand. So what it does is it liberates us from interpreting this passage in a narrow track and seeing it sort of in the dimension of marriage alone. It definitely has an application to marriage, but it is not pitched towards that exclusively. And therefore, we can take the principles of this and apply it to wider community. He opens up by saying these words, two are better than one. Now, of course, we do need to add a little unspoken caveat here, but it is worth adding into this. Two, of course, are only better than one when two work as one. So that's implied in the text. Two are not better than one if two work separately. But if two are to be better than one, then they must work as one. So that's the implied idea right at the beginning of this. And in this opening phrase, two are better than one, we see a real tension of a biblical idea that runs through the whole scriptures. We've touched on this already, but you're going to hear me repeat this all the way through our series together. And that's the tension between the celebration of the individual, but the resistance to individualism. Okay, now this, if you forget a lot of stuff I say, try and hold on to that dynamic idea. So the Bible absolutely celebrates individuality, totally does. We've touched on this already. The image of God, that image celebrated in difference, is just marvelous, and it's all through the text. And we can see example after example of the Lord reaching out to individuals, talking with individuals, using individuals, and connecting with individuals. So we celebrate that. And in fact, we celebrate a faith that transforms the individual. Now, in saying all of that, I think Western culture has done a disservice to the Bible in that we've tended to read the Bible much too individualistically, when much of the Bible is rooted in a community understanding of faith. So actually, God calls Abraham or Abram, and what is the first thing he says? I'm going to make you a nation. I'm going to make you a nation that will bless nations. Before that, when God calls his people out of Egypt and takes them to the foot of Sinai, he says to them, I'm going to make you a kingdom of priests and a holy nation unto God. So right from the very beginning, we're getting ideas of, yes, you've got amazing characters like Moses and Abraham and Elijah and Elisha, and these amazing people, Esther and Ruth, but actually then all of them are contextualized into community. And we've got to see the power of that what the Lord is doing through the scriptures is a beautiful paradoxical idea. It's celebrating the individual, but it's saying this: the individual must never become individualism, because individualism is an idea resisted all the way through the biblical text. And often when we read the Bible, we read it at an individual translation. So often we will read, so let me just pick out randomly a text for you. So Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, you are God's workmanship. Some translations say, you are God's masterpiece, that God has called to good works, which he has prepared for you in advance to do. Now, if you went to church, most people who hear that text interpret that individually. They say, I am God's masterpiece, which of course we are. But strictly speaking, when Paul writes there, the you there, you are his workmanship, is plural. He's not just speaking to John Andrews. He's not just speaking to Denver Thompson. He's not just speaking to Denise or Pat. He's speaking to the whole of the gathered community. And he's saying to New Life, Eden, you collectively are his masterpiece. Now, It doesn't mean that individually I'm not his masterpiece, but what it means is this: I start to read the text from a position of community rather than from a position of individuality. So I start to understand that my spirituality, my design, my call, my purpose has to be understood in the context of a much wider community, that I am placed in a community of faith, and then a community of nations I am sent to. So I'm never allowed, the Bible never allows me to so individualize my faith that I don't think about the community, and to so individualize my faith that I don't think about the world. In fact, the Bible is driving me, God is driving me in exactly the opposite direction. He is moving me as an individual into community. He's setting the orphans in family. He is placing us into his nation. He is making us a holy people set apart for God. The church itself, the word that we translate church, ecclesia, is two sort of words of the New Testament jammed together. Ek, which means sort of out, and kaleo, to call. Ecclesia, the called out ones, the called out community. And by very definition, church is not individual. By very definition, church is community. And so it's really important then that when we read two is better than one, what God is not saying is that the individual's not important. He's not saying that, because we've already established he believes in the individual. He believes in you as an individual. But here's what he's saying: the individual and all the gifts and talents and purposes that I have put within that individual are to be fully and most dynamically realized when they are put into community. It's really a strange thing. My individuality is truly seen in the context of community. When I'm on my own, I'm the only one who sees my individuality. But when I'm in community, my individuality actually has a chance to shine, because, ironically, I'm in community. I am not standing alone, but I am being part of something. And for me, that is, if we can just grasp that and celebrate that, that is so powerful, because we get the best of all worlds. We are celebrated as a one, but we are encouraged to be part of a two, a three, a four, and a five. We are encouraged to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And I try to encourage people with this idea: God's purpose for you will always be bigger than you, and God's purpose for you will always involve more than you. So if I meet people and they talk to me about the purpose of God for their lives, and they are talking in purely individual or inward looking or selfish terms, I know they've got that wrong, or they're understanding that wrong. Because here's what I've discovered: the purpose that God has for the individual will always be bigger than that individual. It's never just about that individual. And secondly, it's always about more. It's always about the community that that individual is either a part of or is going to be called to be a part of. And I think we see that dynamically. I think we see it beautifully. Let me give you one example of it, and then we'll move on, because I could waffle all day on this. So one example of this is Joseph. Joseph, I mean, we love the story of Joseph. It's magnificent. Excuse the pun. It's colorful beyond words. It's a magnificent story. But when you meet Joseph in chapter 37, two things I want you to notice, which are powerful. In chapter 37 of Genesis, when you meet Joseph, two things. Number one, he has two dreams that he completely interprets selfishly. He sees them, he sees himself as the center, and he sees the dreams that God has given him. Well, it doesn't actually say God gave them to them, but later on we come to understand that he interprets the dreams to be about him. Okay? Now hold that thought. The other thing that happens in chapter 37, this is a staggering thought, but you can check it out for yourself. There is not a single reference to God in chapter 37. It is quite striking. Now, fast forward a whack of years, probably 20 plus years. So you've got Joseph in prison and in captivity for about 7 years when he's sort of sold, or sorry, 13 years when he's sold at 17 and then released at 30. And you get the 7 years of plenty, and then we're halfway through the 7 years of famine. So we're looking at a sort of a stretch of time there when Joseph meets his brothers again. And what's striking is that when Joseph then explains what's going on, number one, he explains the dreams in terms of God positioning him for them. And in one verse, or it's a couple of verses in chapter, I think it's 45, just talking off the top of my head, but chapter 45, Joseph references God, I think, 3 to 5 times in just as many sentences. So we go from chapter 37, where God is not mentioned, and the dreams are about him, to chapter 45, where God's all over his interpretation, and he's saying, God sent me here for you. You see what's happened there? The individual who was moving towards individualism has now become completely to a place where he understands that what he's called to be and do is bigger than him, and it's actually for them. And that's the sort of general trajectory that God is taking us. And if you look at other great Bible characters and stories, you'll find a similar trajectory. God is celebrating them as an individual, but resisting individualism so that they can move towards an understanding of their purpose. Hope that makes sense to you in the context of that. So when Solomon says, the teacher says, 2 are better than 1, he is holding for us this tension: individuality, but not individualism. Individuality, but not individualism. And if we can keep holding that idea, that is so, so powerful. So let's get into the text then. There are 4 dynamic standout ideas that we're presented with that show to us the benefit of together in a relational dynamic, and therefore the benefit of the individual folding him or herself into community. So here's the first benefit. We have it in verse 9. He says, 2 are better than 1 because they have good reward for their toil, or good, some translations have, return for their work. Now, here's the first idea I want you to see then. I think he's saying this: together creates synergy. Together creates synergy. 2 are better than 1. And actually, I think what he's pushing at here is not simply an idea of addition, 1 plus 1 equals 2, but I think he's pushing it multiplication. I think he's pushing it the idea that actually when he speaks of 2, he doesn't just mean 2, but he means the multiplication of many, the bringing of many into this context. We'll get to that right at the end of the passage as well. But he's saying this: when 2 work together as 1, there is a return for their work that is not possible if they operate as 2 individuals. So we get this in another part of the scriptures in Leviticus, where it says, 5 will chase 100, but 100 will chase 10,000. Okay? Now, if you do the numbers on that, do the math on that, that doesn't work. So 5 will chase 100 is a ratio of 1 to 20, but 100 will chase 10,000. All right, that's a ratio of 1 to 100. So what's happening, at least what seems to be implied, is as we work together, our ability is multiplied exponentially. It's not just adding, it is multiplying in a staggering way. Now, even science has come to understand the principle of synergy, and I would argue there are many non-spiritual contexts that are learning synergy faster than the church. And as a result of learning synergy, that is the synchronization of our energies, the bringing together of the individuals into team or into cohesion, actually they're getting tremendous return for their work. I know a talk of football will bore you, but a couple of seasons ago, a football team won the Premier League called Leicester City. Now, that was a shock to everybody. No one saw that coming. And when you look at the Leicester City team that won the Premier League, individually, there were teams that had better players person for person. But what somehow the manager managed to do was unify them into a synergistic group that was simply irresistible. And they were winning games they really shouldn't have won. And everyone thought, well, they'll win a few, but then they'll blow up. But they just kept winning and they just kept going. And actually, if you look at the sum of their parts, this should not have worked. But when you put the parts together and they synergize, when 2, 3, 4, 11, 15, 20 become one, wow, something incredible happened. Now, they still had to have talent. We're not denying the talent there. But the point is, their synergy took their talent further than it should have gone. They were able to do more than they thought was possible. And I think that's a dynamic spiritual principle. We will come back to that principle when we talk about seeing together from Genesis 11. You'll see that in the most incredible way. And we'll refer to that again in terms of, say, building church together. So hold that thought. So the idea that two become one and there's a synergy. Now, let me take you into the New Testament, because this idea is rampant in the New Testament. In fact, it's funny when we come to think of Paul, Saul, who became Paul, many of us know him as the Apostle Paul, we tend to think of him as an individual, this sort of amazing Superman, Lone Ranger, you know, rampaging all over the Roman world, planting churches all by himself. Nothing could be further from the truth. In the book of Acts, for example, there's virtually no context. There's maybe only one when he goes to Athens, and some would say his experience at Athens wasn't as good as it could have been. Virtually in the book of Acts, that's the only moment where we can see Paul on his own. Every other time, Paul is with people in team, traveling together, doing things together. And for example, Romans chapter 16, that phenomenal conclusion to that amazing letter that he writes to the Roman Christians. In Romans 16, Paul lists 37 individuals, many of whom work with him. And in that list, there are also 10 women listed. I would argue one of them is a teacher, one's an apostle, and certainly one is a leader delegated by Paul with apostolic authority. You've got some serious stuff going on in Romans 16. And all of this points to the idea that Paul learned the idea that two is better than one, and he worked together, contrary to the general impression we get of Paul, because we tend to speak of him in highly individualistic terms. One of Paul's favorite words when he writes about his friends and team is the word synergos. Now, if you hear the Greek word synergos, you can hear the echo of the word that we get out of that, synergy, same work, synergos, okay? So that's the idea of the word, same work. And let me show you one example how Paul uses it, and then I'll reflect on this a bit. When he's writing to the church of Philippi, Paul writes and he talks about a young man called Epaphroditus, and he says, Epaphroditus, my brother, my co-worker, the NIV translates it, and my fellow soldier. So brother there literally can be translated from the same womb. It's a beautiful word, adelphos. And then we've got co-worker. Now, some translations will have fellow worker. And the idea of that word, that's the word synergos, one who has the same work. And here's the idea of that word. It's the idea of side by side working. So Paul is saying, really, really importantly, Epaphroditus isn't working for me, he's working with me. Okay? Now, it's one word of a difference, but it is a radical difference in experience. People who work for you, that's not always synergy, but people who work with you, that's where synergy is found. And the word synergos, or synergoi, when it speaks of fellow workers, is used 13 times in the New Testament. Of the 13 times it's used, Paul uses it 12 times. It's one of his favorite words when referring to his friends and his team. And in fact, if you go back to Romans 16 that I referenced earlier on, he uses the word synergoi, fellow workers or fellow worker, 3 times in the one chapter. And when we grab that idea, we are really understanding something powerful. Here's even the mighty Apostle Paul with an IQ that is literally off the scale. I mean, he's a seriously clever man. He's a high energy, high capacity individual, without question. But what's Paul doing? He's resisting individualism. He refuses to be the individual on his own. And what's he doing? He's gathering team. He's gathering fellow workers. He's gathering men and women. He's training younger men and women. He's bringing them into his world so that as fellow workers, they achieve. And Paul, with his team, in the space of 10 years, so evangelize 4 major provinces of the Roman world that Paul is able to say, my work here is done. And he's moving to regions beyond. It's quite staggering. Now, Paul could not have done all of that on his own. No matter how brilliant he is, he's working in the context of team together. So when Solomon tells us 2 is better than 1, what's Solomon doing? Well, he's reflecting back to our creational order. Let us make man. Let us make the humans in our image. And actually, you'll start to see that thread run the whole way through. What then someone like Paul is picking up on and understanding is actually when 2 work as 1, we are able to achieve beyond the sum of our parts. It's not just Paul plus Timothy or Paul plus Silas or Paul plus Titus. No. It is a multiplication of their energy, which takes their ability to achieve beyond the sum of its parts. And that is the mysterious idea, scientifically proven, of synergy. It has a multiplying impact. And that's why relatively small Christian communities can have a dynamic, disproportionate influence on their world. It's not about how many of us there are, it's about how well we are working together. And again, we will come back to that idea when we look at the book of Nehemiah. So I want to seed that idea into your thinking. So together, he says, creates synergy. Second principle is this: together expresses support. So look at the next part, verse 10. If one falls, someone to lift him up. It says that, let me just read it correctly. But if they fall, speaking of the individual, one will lift his fellow or friend up. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has no one to pick him up. So the idea here is that actually at some point in our lives, we're going to stumble. And what a wonderful thing when we stumble, we've got somebody there to pick us up. But here's what Solomon says: woe to the person, pity the person. I mean, it's a strong inference here in the Hebrew text. Woe to you. It's very, very strong. Woe to the person who falls and has no one to lift him up or lift her up. So the language is masculine, but it's applicable to all, of course. So we've got this incredible idea that together expresses support. I love what Solomon says in his Proverbs. He says, a man of many companions may come to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Now, I want you to see that Solomon makes a distinction back in Proverbs that we understand here today in our modern context. There is a distinction between a companion and a friend. Okay, so let me give you an example of that. Social media today, we've got Facebook and Instagram and all sorts of stuff. I can't even remember how many people I'm friends with on Facebook, but they're not friends. Now, some of them are, but most of them are companions. They're people who know about me, know of me, and in some shape or form have connected to me. But actually, they're not friends, they are companions. And so there's an actual contrast in this text between the use of friend and the use of companion. In other words, Solomon is saying it's possible to be surrounded by people, but not have true friendship within that, not have true community. And what's the test of community? The test of community is this: when you fall down, somebody's going to pick you up. If there's no one picking you up, then you've got companions, not friends. That's right. Yeah, you've got a world of companions, but no friends. So Solomon is digging into this. There is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And I know sometimes we interpret that, speak of Jesus as the brother who sticks closer than anybody. And that's cool. I love that. But again, don't miss the power of human community that he's putting here by rushing to the Jesus interpretation before you've got the original interpretation. Here he's saying this: actually, there is a friend, there is community that sticks closer than a brother. And this is so powerful to me. I saw this dynamically illustrated today. Please forgive me for what I'm about to share. I hope it doesn't surprise you or shock you, but my mother passed away today. So she was taken into hospital on at the weekend, and she's been a wonderful woman and well looked after by family. My sister and brother-in-law taking care of her, and we expected her to get out of hospital on Friday, and her condition deteriorated very quickly. It wasn't COVID related; there were other issues with her, and my sister got a call at 11:30, and the hospital very kindly said, "Look, you can come up," because it wasn't COVID connected. We were allowed family in her little room with her. She was put in a little small room on her own. My brother-in-law was there. My sister was there. Their two sons, my nephews, came up to see her. And I was on FaceTime with her from 12 o'clock until she passed into heaven at 5:10 tonight. Now, why am I sharing that? Because I saw afresh the power of this. My mother, in her most challenging moment of life, about to pass from this life to the next, and she loved Jesus since she was 15. And I know that I literally watched her tonight breathe her last breath. And I know that the moment she took that last breath, she was instantly in the presence of the Lord, absent from the body and present with God. But here's what I want you to see. In that whole time, from 12 o'clock to 5:10, someone was holding her hand. Someone was stroking her brow. Someone was attending to her needs. People were speaking to her. My youngest daughter, she loved my youngest daughter singing. My youngest daughter was singing to her over FaceTime. I was reading her the Psalms. Her favorite hymn was "It Is Well With My Soul." My wife, my daughter, and myself sang it to her literally 10 minutes before she went to heaven. Now, I want to say, listen, it's facing death and sickness, one of the most challenging and terrifying things a human can do. But when we face it surrounded by community, not just with a faith within, which my mother had. So my mother could have died on her own and she'd still be in heaven. But actually, what a glorious thing that today my mother was allowed to pass into the next life, into eternity, surrounded by a community that loved her, that literally celebrated her, that wept over her, that rejoiced over her, that held her hand. And there was a beautiful, tender moment. My nephew was there, and I could see where the camera was put. I could see my nephew holding her hand, and I saw this, and my mother was in and out of consciousness at this point. And I saw my mother grip his hand. She gripped his hand. And then he leaned over and kissed her and whispered something into her ear. And through the mask, she spoke to him. I want to tell you, that's what this is about. That actually, pity, woe to the man who falls and has no one. No one cares, no one notices, and no one's there. That's got to be one of the most terrible experiences for any human. To be alone in the point of need, to be alone when they are in pain, to be alone. Now listen, some of you said, well, John, why are you teaching tonight if your mother's just passed, because my mother was one of my greatest fans, one of my greatest supporters. She invested her whole life into helping me be what I am today, and helping me achieve everything I've achieved. And she would be horrified if I said, right, I'm not teaching tonight because my mom passed away. She'd be saying, John, you got to do this. It's what you were born to do. That's what you told me every single day. And so that's why I'm doing it, in honor to her, because I love her, and also because it's what she represented, and also because it speaks to something deeper in our community. We have a hope that is greater. We have a faith that is greater. We have power that is greater. We have something that is not only within us as individuals, and we must hold on to that, but we've also got something in the community. There is something in the community that is powerful and refreshing and life transforming. Woe to him who falls and has no one to pick him up. My prayer for all of us is that we will never experience that loneliness. We will never experience alone in our moment of need, whatever that moment of need looks like, but we will be lifted up by the community around us. So he says that the two's better than one because two together express support. Here's the third idea, and then we're sort of moving on to the fourth and wrapping this up. I must watch the clock. I spoke far too long last week for you. So here's the third one. Together delivers sustenance. Now look at this, verse 11. If two lie together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? Now, this is often where we think about marriage and we imply or infer sexuality into this, but you've just got to trust me on this. The Hebrew text does not imply sexual union here. It is literally simply lying down to sleep. That's the implication here. So if the Bible wanted to talk about sexual union, it would use slightly different language on this. So when two lie down, they keep warm. How can one keep warm alone? And of course, in the context of the ancient Near East world, unlike maybe the experience that many of us have had, certainly in recent years where we have our own bedrooms and we sort of sleep alone, actually in the ancient Near East world, generally speaking, families slept together. Children wouldn't have their own rooms. They would all be in one room, sharing sometimes. In fact, even Jesus infers this in a parable where he talks about a man rapping on the door and asking for bread. And he says, I'm already in bed with my family. And literally, Jesus would have understood that actually the kids are in bed with the parents, or they are in the same room as them. And often, of course, depending if they were wealthy or poor, if they were in the poorer end of peasant class, as it were, then the room they slept in may also be the room that they convert into a dining area and an eating area. So you've got this idea. And of course, in cold Middle Eastern nights, what do you want to do? You want to get close to a warm body. And I remember we talked about snow earlier on, and I remember living in Belfast, and before my mother and father had central heating put in. Remember those days? Some of you remember those. Incredible. I mean, my kids wouldn't survive without central heating and the internet. I mean, if those two things were taken away, they'd die. I don't know what they'd do. So I remember the days in Belfast when before I was 8 years old, we had central heating put in when I was 8. And I remember winters, no exaggeration, we're in the attic room of our house in Belfast. My parents bought a 3-story house, like a townhouse, a terrace house, but 3 stories. We were in the attic. And I can remember genuinely scraping the ice off the inside of the window. Okay? I mean, amazing. And we would go to bed like with a couple of layers of clothes and even a hat, right? Incredible stuff. And me and my brother shared a bed. And I want to tell you, that was like a human hot water bottle is absolutely incredible. And we would get so warm that we'd end up having to sort of move away from each other in the bed. And even now, my wife will say to me, you're like a hot water bottle in bed. So when she comes in maybe late from working, she's freezing, she jumps in, and the first thing she wants to do is get as close to me as possible because she's after heat. But of course, one on their own is vulnerable to hypothermia. One on their own is vulnerable to a drop in temperature and actually it's flesh on flesh or body on body is one of the fastest ways to heat us up without technology to help us. That's what Solomon is referring to. He's saying that when you're on your own, you lose strength, you lose energy, you lose, as it were, that heat going out of your body makes you vulnerable to weakness and vulnerable to, as it were, disintegration in your own well-being. But when you're in community, the community, proper community, sitting down community, literally in this language, lying down community, will generate heat and therefore sustain you, uplift you. And you'll know, some of you will have this experience where you've got so cold you can hardly function. But when you warm up, your faculties improve. Now, of course, you can overheat too, but if we're so cold, we can't function, we can't think, because actually the heat leaving our body is starting to affect even our ability to function properly. And so warmth is also about sustenance and renewal and strengthening us, but also allowing us to function well in that context. I hope that makes sense. And I know you'll probably know that by experience. Here's the last idea, and I'm finishing off for you. The last of the four. He says, together, lastly, produces strength. Now, I love this in verse 12. Though a man might prevail against one, and by implication, one who is alone, two will withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. Okay, so now I want you to notice there, if you can, note the deliberate numeric progression in the verse. It goes 1, 2, 3. You notice that? Now that's a real deliberate, well, in my opinion, it's a very deliberate conclusion to this passage, and it also gives us a sort of a symmetry in the passage. So remember, the passage is started with 2 is better than 1, and then the passage finishes this with 1, 2, 3. Okay, so you've got a numeric beginning and a numeric end, and it's all deliberate. And even in this final use, the use of 1 is not denying the individual, it's celebrating it, but it's saying there's something better there. And so you get this beautiful progression. 1 may be overpowered. 2 can defend themselves, he's sort of saying. The cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. So let's have a little bit of a look at that. 1, 2, 3. So again, he's not saying 1 is bad. He's just saying 3 is best. Okay, now that's really important. So 1 may be overpowered. There's nothing wrong with being a 1 on your own. He's just saying, actually, that's not the best for us. If we want to really be powerful, we've got to move from being 1 to being part of something bigger. Okay? And in that progression from 1 to 3, I think we get the movement from independence, 1, to interdependence, 3. Okay? That's a big journey. I think when we move from 1 to 3, we're moving from I-centric to we-centric. We're moving from I to we. So our language starts to change. We're stopping, we're not so much using the language of I, we're now using the language of we. We move from isolation to community. And this last one's a bit cheesy, please forgive me. We move from ego to we go. Sorry about that. That's totally cheesy. Throw that in the bin if you want to, but there we are. So it goes from I go to we go. Okay. So there's a gorgeous little African proverb, and it goes something like this. If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. Isn't that beautiful? I mean, that could be in the Bible. It's not strictly in the way that it's phrased, but it's absolutely gloriously beautiful. It has captured a dynamic truth that is totally biblical. If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And that's exactly the imagery here that's being caught for us in verse 12. And I want you to see the climactic image that he has for us. He says this as he concludes. He says, a threefold cord, or a cord of three strands, is not quickly broken. Now, you'll probably grab there, he's using the imagery of a rope in that context. And the word that he uses here for broken is fascinating, and it's worth digging into. So the word here is natak, natak. And the word literally doesn't just mean to break, and that's why the translation is a wee bit misleading. But the idea of the word here is to tear apart, to rip apart, to pull apart, or to drag away. So hold that thought now, hold that definition of natak for me, and think of a rope. How do you destroy a rope? Now, if you really want to destroy a rope, you unravel it. You separate the strands one from another. I can cut a rope, but you end up with two ropes. You still got actually a strong rope. But if you truly want to destroy a rope, fundamentally destroy a rope, you unravel the strands. That's exactly what Solomon is saying here. He's saying the more strands are intertwined, dynamically and powerfully intertwined, the harder it is to unravel them. The harder it is to rip them apart. The harder it is to pull them apart. The harder it is to tear them apart. And if those strands can remain intertwined, individually those strands, a child could break them. If you wrap enough strands together, it holds a cruiser. It can hold a 30-ton ship. It's able to do amazing things, and yet the individual strands of the rope are totally vulnerable and potentially so easily to break. Yet when wrapped together, you end up with something that is truly powerful. And the writer here, Solomon, is saying it's not quickly broken. Now note that he's not saying it's not impossible to break it. He's saying it won't break quickly. It won't break easily. You're going to have to work really hard to break this. Why? Because the strands are intertwined. Now, I've been to marriage ceremonies where people have said the cord of three strands is husband, wife, and Jesus, and I'm cool with that. It's a wonderful image. It's a brilliant idea, and I wouldn't want to push back on that one little bit. But I would want to add this idea that that's not what Solomon is talking about. What Solomon is talking about is when humans come together, like we talked about last week, and learn to sit as one, something happens in those humans that turns them into a dynamically powerful rope, is the image, which becomes really hard to break and really hard to destroy. And it's interesting, and I think it was Pat that reflected on this when she talked about the power of the enemy to separate us. And you can absolutely see that. And I think, thank God for the technology that's helped us. Thank God that we're able in some, I know you guys are still trying to meet in some form in person, even though it's restricted. Thank God we've still been able to do those things. But my goodness, hasn't it shown us again that when we stand alone, we are desperately vulnerable. When we come together, we are strong. Now, intuitively, we know that's true. Intuitively, without the Bible, without being a Christian, if you went out, in planet secular, intuitively, people know that's a good idea. But here we have over and over again the evidence of it in the biblical text, that the individual alone is strong. Two, can even overcome, but the cord of three, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 100, 20, 2000 is not easily or quickly broken. And isn't it striking that when we think of the Lord Jesus himself, our wonderful Savior, he talks about the fact that when the shepherd is struck, the sheep will scatter. That actually that what the enemy tries to do in that moment is scatter that community, but yet Jesus in also his post-resurrection glory, what does he do? He gathers that community. He brings them back together. Over a 40-day period, he's bringing healing to them. He's bringing the word of God to them. He's bringing the promise of the Holy Spirit to them. It's all going on. And then he says, now stay together, stay as one, stay unified, sit together, walk together, and then the Holy Spirit will come and he will give you all that you need to go forward into this world. Isn't it amazing? The enemy in the Garden of Eden sought to scatter. God seeks to unify. The enemy tries to divide. God wants to bring together. The enemy tried to scatter those disciples of Jesus, and Jesus brings them together. And that's the challenge we face, because we do have an enemy who understands the power of one becoming two, becoming three, becoming four, and truly joining together. So I want to encourage you with that. Two is better than one. Two can be hard work. Two requires investment. Two requires energy. Two requires sacrifice. But two is worth it. If we are prepared to invest into community, whatever that means for us in the context of our journey, then I believe that two together can produce strength. Two together takes us further than we could ever go together. Two together is a smart idea, and two together enables us to achieve things we could never achieve on our own. And I am so grateful that we serve a God who can take an individual and do amazing things with that individual. But I also am so glad that God actually wants me to be part of a dynamic community, so that I understand that my individuality is truly appreciated and enriched and fully utilized in its potential in the context of the wider community around me. So may God help us as we make our journey to really commit to an understanding that two is better than one. I hope that's been a blessing to you and a help to you as we've reflected on Ecclesiastes. Bless your hearts.